Assalamu alaikum. Very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to yet another episode of Perceptive Learning Zone. And I'm your mentor, Mr. Hamza Nasser. And today we are going to be talking about the Epstein files, okay? So let's start off with our introduction, right? First of all, so those of you who have been following the recent news, right, you know that Jeffrey Epstein's ascent into the highest levels of global power, it was not a sudden event, but it was a gradual and calculated process that was built on proximity to wealth, political authority, as well as institutional prestige. Now, Mr. Epstein, he understood a fundamental law of human perception that people trust those whom powerful people trust. So, by embedding himself into elite circles, Epstein did not just gain access, he gained legitimacy. And over time, this legitimacy, it became one of his greatest protective shields. So, let's talk about how he built legitimacy through elite associations, right? So, public records, flight logs, as well as photographs, ladies and gentlemen, it documented Jeffrey Epstein's associations with some of the most recognizable figures in the world, which include former US President Bill Clinton as well as the current President Donald Trump. Clinton, for example, was reported in publicly released flight logs to have flown on Epstein's private aircraft multiple times during humanitarian trips in the early 2000s, though Clinton has consistently denied any knowledge of Epstein's criminal behavior. Trump similarly was photographed with Epstein at social events in New York in the 1990s and early 2000s, but later he stated publicly that he distanced himself from Epstein long before his first arrest. Now, these associations, fellas, what they do is they illustrate a very important sociological phenomena, that is proximity. It creates perceived credibility, right? So when the public it sees a person being welcomed into the company of presidents, then their instinct is not to suspect but to trust. So moving on, we talk about his wealth, philanthropy, as well as the halo effect. So Jeffrey Epstein, he reinforced his credibility through philanthropy and academic involvement. He donated millions of dollars to scientific institutions and other universities. Reports indicated that he made a heavy donation to Harvard University program, where he introduced a department, some program along the lines of mathematics, biology, and evolutionary dynamics, right? He funded also these donations, they allowed him basically to associate or align with prominent scientists and innovators, including meetings with high profile entrepreneurs like Elon Musk. Now, again, these meetings and associations, they did not imply wrongdoing by those individuals, but they strengthened Epstein's image as a legitimate financier and an intellectual patron, right? So this strategy was highly effective because you see, fellows, wealth and philanthropy, it often creates what researchers call a halo effect, right? It is a cognitive bias where positive impressions in one area they influence opinions in another, right? Studies in social psychology, they've shown that people who are perceived as wealthy and charitable, they are less likely to be viewed with suspicion even when warning signs exist. So Epstein's donations and elite connections, well, they basically helped construct this halo, right? Yet beneath this image, ladies and gentlemen, a different reality was slowly emerging. According to court records, Epstein faced allegations from dozens of victims over many years. By 2019, law enforcement investigations and civil lawsuits had identified more than 80 alleged victims, with some estimates suggesting the number may have exceeded 100. And the Epstein victims compensation program that was established after his death, it ultimately paid more than 120 million US dollars in compensation to over 150 survivors. Now, these numbers alone, they illustrate the scale of the harm that was associated with his actions. Okay, so moving on, next we talk about his legal maneuvers and controversial protections. Despite all of these allegations that we just talked about, Jeffrey Epstein was able to maintain freedom and influence for years. Now, one of the most controversial moments, it came in the year 2008 when he negotiated a plea argument with federal prosecutors led by Alexander Acosta. Now, instead of facing multiple federal charges that could have resulted in life imprisonment, Jeffrey Epstein pleaded guilty to state charges and received an 18-month sentence in a county jail. Even more unusually, he was granted work release privileges that allowed him to leave the facility up to 12 hours per day, up to 6 days per week. Now, legal analysts, fellows, they have widely criticized this agreement. The DOJ, the U.S. Department of Justice, it later conducted an internal review and it concluded that prosecutors had exercised poor judgment, right? For victims, this agreement was very, very devastating. It reinforced a perception that wealth and influence, they could substantially alter the course of justice. So, you see, financial power, it has played a very central role in his rise. Much of his wealth was linked to Epstein's relationship with billionaire retail magnate Leslie Wexner, and Wexner basically granted Epstein power of power of attorney and control over significant financial assets. Now, at one point, Epstein owned a Manhattan mansion that was valued over 70 million US dollars, one of the largest private homes in New York City. He also owned private jets, multiple estates, and a private island in the Caribbean. His total net worth was estimated at over 500 million US dollars at the time of his death. This wealth allowed Epstein to construct environments that reinforced his authority. His properties were staffed by employees who were bound by confidentiality agreements. His private jet, that was later dubbed in media reports as the Lolita Express ride, it flew hundreds of trips over many years. Flight logs show the aircraft flew more than 600 recorded flights in an 18-year period between 1995 and 2013. Private transportation, private residences, as well as private staff, they created layers upon layers of separation between Epstein and public scrutiny. Now, these statistics, ladies and gentlemen, they show us basically that wealth, it significantly affects legal outcomes, right? Studies that are published in legal journals, they have found that defendants, who have access to high quality legal representation, they are far more likely to receive reduced sentences or favorable plea agreements, right, compared to those without financial resources. So Epstein, he had access to some of the most expensive attorneys in the United States, including former federal prosecutors and elite defense lawyers. So let's talk finally about the collapse of his influence and the societal impact, right? So when Jeffrey Epstein was arrested again in July 2019, it marked a dramatic paradigm shift. Now, federal prosecutors, they charged him with sex trafficking offenses involving minors. Evidence seized during the searches of his properties, it reportedly included thousands of photographs and digital files. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Surveys that were conducted at the time, they showed overwhelming public concern. A Reuters/Ipsos poll, it found that over 75% of Americans were closely following the case, reflecting its enormous societal impact. However, just weeks later, Mr. Epstein was found dead in his jail cell. His death was officially ruled a suicide by hanging, right? Yet the circumstances, they raised some serious institutional questions, okay? Reports revealed that required monitoring procedures had not been followed, and two guards were later charged with falsifying records. According to the U.S. Department of Justice Inspector General, staffing failures and negligence that contributed to the situation. And Epstein's death, it had significant, massive legal ramifications. It prevented a criminal trial that could have publicly examined the full scope of evidence. And for victims, this basically meant losing the opportunity to testify in court. And for society, what it meant was that, unanswered questions, they remained, right? Then attention shifted to Epstein's associate, Ghislaine Maxwell, who was arrested in 2020 and later convicted in 2021 on federal charges related to sex trafficking. In 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Her conviction confirmed in court that Jeffrey Epstein had not operated entirely alone. The broader societal implications of Epstein's case are profound. Research consistently shows us that institutional trust declines when people believe that justice is applied unevenly. And according to the Edelman trust barometer, the global trust in institutions has declined significantly over the past 2 decades, with perceived inequality and elite impunity being cited as the major factors. So, to conclude all of this, fellas, to summarize all of this in a nutshell, Epstein's case has become a symbol of this distrust. It has illustrated how influence can shape perception, how it can delay accountability and complicate the justice mechanism, right? His ability, Epstein's ability to operate for decades despite allegations, it highlights systemic vulnerabilities, right? Perhaps the most disturbing statistic is not financial but human. Many of Epstein's victims were teenagers at the time of the abuse. So studies show that victims of exploitation now, they often suffer long-term psychological effects including depression, anxiety, as well as PTSD, that is post-traumatic stress disorder. According to the National Institute of Justice, survivors of sexual exploitation, they are significantly more likely to receive to experience lifelong mental health challenges, right? Ultimately, Jeffrey Epstein's power, it is very clear that from the case that it was not based solely on money, it was based on perception. Wealth created access, access created, legitimacy, right? Legitimacy, it created protection, and this protection, it allowed misconduct to remain hidden for years. And his story, it demonstrates ultimately to conclude a very harsh reality about human systems, that influence can delay accountability, but it cannot erase truth forever, right? Will that be all for now, fellows? Thank you so much for being a great audience, and please don't hesitate to like, share, and subscribe. We'll be back with more, interesting content. Till then, keep rocking and stay blessed. God bless you all. Have a nice weekend. Assalamu alaikum.